My talk today is really about the history and legacy of a question. What can Hawaii teach America about race? Last year, I was asked to respond to this question for an online forum, and the forum sought to uncover if Hawaii, which they presumed to be more pleasantly multicultural and less impacted by racial problems, had any lessons to teach the continental U.S. I responded with my concerns about this endeavor, noting that the forum seemed to wrongly suggest that Hawaii was A, somehow immune to racism, B, not really part of or occupied by the United States, and C, only worthwhile as an instructional model. The organizers assured me that I could be critical of my contributions, so I sent in a short piece noting the history of U.S. settler colonialism in Hawaii and the exciting contemporary work of Kanaka Maoli or Native Hawaiians in revitalizing cultural practices and recreating rights to land. When the piece was published, however, among other edits, I was stunned to see that all instances of the word colonialism had been removed. So the irony of this episode to me is that my research directly explores how this question, what can Hawaii teach America about race, is bound up in the history and ongoing presence of U.S. settler colonialism in Hawaii, even as it obscures it. For in fact, this question is approximately a century old. It is a question that has enjoyed a prominent place in both the history of social scientific studies about Hawaii and the securing of Hawaii as a state in 1959. It was the question at the forefront of the research of Romanzo Adams, the founder of the sociology department at the University of Hawaii in 1919, and it would animate the research of that department and other social scientific studies of Hawaii for decades to come. The contemporary popular understanding of Hawaii as a unique melting pot, as an ethnic rainbow, racial mixed plate, among countless other cheery metaphors, can all be traced back to Adams asking in 1919 and throughout his career what Hawaii could teach America about race. All of these metaphors continue to make it difficult to recognize structural white supremacy and settler colonialism in Hawaii, obscuring a long history of racism and dispossession that targets Native Hawaiians in particular ways. So my larger book project situates Adams' research not only within the Chicago School of Sociology, where he was trained, but also within a deeper transnational genealogy of Western social scientists studying race in the Pacific. The central argument of the book is that settler colonialism in Hawaii and Polynesia more broadly is fueled by what I call a logic of possession through whiteness. In this logic, the Polynesian race is repeatedly positioned as almost white, often literally as the descendants of the Aryan race, in such a way that allows white settlers to claim indigeneity in Polynesia, since according to this logic, whiteness itself is indigenous to Polynesia. I argue that this logic specifically developed in the Western history of social scientific studies about Polynesian racial origins from the mid to late 19th century through the mid 20th century. These studies were nicknamed the Polynesian problem. The problem to white social scientists being how to determine where Polynesians really came from. Yet the logic of possession through whiteness has circulated much more widely than social science, influencing popular representation, law and policy, and more. So I theorize that this process of whiteness making itself indigenous is descriptive of settler colonialism more globally, in the sense that across settler colonial nation states, white settlers often claim that white people are the rightful owners of a place, that they are more indigenous than indigenous people. Gender is also important to this formulation, since indigenous peoples become feminized possessions in colonial discourse, often represented as exotic treasures won through conquest, while at the same time needing to be tamed and domesticated to abide by Western racial and gender norms. So it's important to note that whiteness in my analysis is not reducible to a set of phenotypes or group identity label. Indeed, even those Polynesians who may have looked white to European observers were not simply extended the privileges of whiteness. Jeffrey Geiger has written of the European perception of Polynesian whiteness that, at least as significant as this desire to project whiteness onto a Polynesian canvas, is the fact that Polynesians are ultimately never quite white enough. To put it another way, using Cheryl Harris's important formulation of whiteness as property, Polynesians can never own whiteness as property, but Polynesianness becomes part of the property of whiteness for white settlers. Notably, the designation of whiteness as indigenous to Polynesia, and thus the proper owners of Polynesia, purposely sought to replace the quite different definition of indigeneity held by Native Hawaiians, which emphasizes relationships and responsibilities to land as our ancestor. I argue that Native Hawaiians and other Polynesians have long worked against the logic of possession through whiteness, continually attempting to regenerate connections that have been damaged by the installation of imposed Western racial and gendered hierarchies. So my talk today is roughly divided into two parts. I first provide a further introduction to my theorizing of the logic of possession through whiteness and illustrate how this logic worked, specifically in Adams projecting an expected Neo-Hawaiian race that would be uniquely American and almost white. And second, I turn to the work of two Polynesian contemporary artists, Yuki Kihara and Adrian Pao. I argue that these artists challenge the logic of possession through whiteness by acknowledging the violence of imposed settler colonial ideologies of race and gender while working to regenerate indigenous forms of recognition and connection. These artists illustrate what I call regenerative refusals. Regenerative refusals are actions that seek to restore balance and life to indigenous communities that continue to live with the structures of settler colonialism. Drawn from the theories of other Native feminist scholars, including Leanne Simpson and Audra Simpson, regenerative refusals are, in my framing, concerned with divesting our communities from racialized and gendered hierarchies. Native feminism seeks to draw attention to how settler colonialism is a fundamentally gendered process that relies on the installation of heteropatriarchy and to destroy colonized communities' connections to their bodies, to each other, and to the land. Regenerative refusals seek to restore these connections, often through the clear rejection of ongoing colonial ideologies, both imposed upon and sometimes deeply internalized within indigenous communities. Regenerative refusals in my usage are not about a return to exactly what things were like before. It is an ongoing reckoning with settler colonialism rather than a denial of it. So regenerative refusals further offer a lens with which to understand some of the tensions between competing visions of justice among indigenous communities. For many Polynesian artists and activists, it is clear that decolonization is not truly decolonization unless it structurally overturns Western hierarchies of race, gender, and sexuality. Nonetheless, others willingly collaborate with settler colonial state governments or maintain Western notions of race, gender, and sexuality in the name of receiving their due or at least taking the best we can get. Those who reject such moderate offers from the settler colonial governments or industries are often depicted as crazy, hostile, or ignorant. The mainstream media and local politicians repeatedly describe Native Hawaiian activists in such terms, most recently in relation to the fight to protect Mauna Kea, which is a sacred mountain on the Big Island of Hawaii, from the construction of a 30-meter telescope that would require construction over the size of 8 football fields. And it's slated to be built despite clear evidence of adverse environmental and cultural impacts. However, if we analyze such refusals through a framework of regeneration, there is space to recognize that such rejections are not merely empty negative challenges to settler colonialism, but also positive future-oriented acts aiming to realize a different way of being in and relating to the world. Okay. So this is kind of beginning part one. And to begin, I would like to make clear that Polynesians in my usage refers to the broad oceanic region that's commonly understood as this triangle that goes from Hawaii out to New Zealand, Aotearoa, and out to Rapa Nui or Easter Island. Sometimes people think when I talk about Polynesia, I'm only talking about French Polynesia, which is the name of a particular French territory that includes Tahiti, right? But I'm talking more about this whole broad region that includes also includes Tonga, Samoa, Cook Islands, the Marquesas, right? And so this image is drawn from the work of Peter Buck or Te Rangi Hiroa, who is actually a Maori social scientist who, in engagement with white social scientists, he was also engaging theories of where Polynesians came from. And so this map kind of maps out the different theories about where Polynesians came from, including some thought maybe from South America, others from Asia, but the big point of contention for white social scientists and for Te Rangi Hiroa was basically if Polynesians had gone through Melanesia. And the the big deal with that was that Melanesia was understood in white Western ideologies to be black, right? And so there was this idea that Polynesians were white and Melanesians were black, and so a lot of white social scientists and Peter Buck himself actually argued that Polynesians went through Micronesia and didn't go through Melanesia, and so therefore there was no racial mixing, and that Polynesians were very distinct from Melanesians, right? So that's kind of the broader discourses that I look at in the rest of my book, right? Yeah. So really, since the earliest encounters between Europeans and indigenous Pacific Islanders, Europeans had expressed this particular fascination and identification with the racial origins of Polynesians. Polynesians seem to represent natural man in his purest state. Through the 19th century, ethnologists including John de Merlang, S. Percy Smith, and Abraham Fornander tested and extended such romantic ideas about Polynesian almost whiteness through theories about Aryanism, which at this time was largely a matter of linguistic comparisons with Sanskrit. And later physical anthropologists of the 20th century, including Louis Robert Sullivan and Harry Shapiro, used physical measurements of the body to further prove that Polynesians were close, if ancient, relatives of Caucasians, having similarly branched off close to the Aryan stem. These are just two images from Louis Sullivan's work. And if you can't read, on the left it says, Indonesian type, he represents the Mongoloid element with Negroid characters. And on the right is the Polynesian type. In him, nature seems just to have missed producing a Caucasian. So these are both Polynesians, right? And so Louis Sullivan's idea was that he could kind of separate out those who might have more like Melanesian influence, and declare like the whiter, so-called whiter one, the true Polynesian type. So from this logic that was generated in these scientific studies, I theorize settler colonialism as a process of making whiteness indigenous, in the sense that white settlers are claiming rightful and natural ownership of both Polynesia and Polynesians more broadly, and that indigeneity is in this construction being seen as the proper possession of man with the capital M, referring to the post-Enlightenment ideal of the human as the white male transcendent subject, as Denise and Sylvia Winter write about, right? So Romanzo Adams, who worked in the 1920s and 30s, differed from these earlier social scientists who were obsessed with properly classifying the Polynesian race as a white race, because he narrowly focused on what potential lessons Hawaii had to offer the continental US, and had little to no interest in the larger Polynesian or oceanic regions. Adams was interested in coming to Hawaii because of his training in sociology at the University of Chicago under Robert Park. Park and his colleagues predicted that as Asian immigrants to the U.S. advanced through the stages of the race relations cycle, which included contact, conflict, accommodation, and assimilation, they were destined to completely assimilate within American society. As Henry Yu writes, to Park and others from the Chicago School, Hawaii would become a fantasy island, the ultimate racial laboratory. However, I see the same logics of this earlier literature about Polynesian whiteness circulating in Adams' work, especially in his unshakable belief that whiteness could win out in Hawaii, that whiteness could engulf and dissipate racial difference. This disappearance of racial difference hinged on the ability of Adams to reason that Native Hawaiians and Asian immigrants to Hawaii were capable of becoming white, or white enough. This knowledge was enabled by these prior Polynesian problem studies in both Aryanism and physical anthropology that had demonstrated that whiteness had ancestral roots and branches in Asia and Polynesia. So in this sense, I see Adams' work and the idea of the melting pot as an extension of these earlier studies. This link has been really overlooked by studies that assume that race relations in Hawaii should only be understood in relation to the United States. By analyzing Adams in conversation with this broader literature, the transnational legacies of the construction of the Polynesian race as almost white, which far predate the U.S. occupation of Hawaii, provide an important frame within which settler colonialism comes into sharper focus, despite the idea of the melting pot's attempt to erase the existence of settler colonialism. So This imagined melting pot idea is illustrated really well in this diagram from 1930 that was published in the Oakland Tribune about Romanzo Adams' work. And in this diagram, you can see deeply exoticized and racially typed images of an Asiatic and a Polynesian that are symbolically added to the European to magically produce a Hawaiian. Yeah, so much to say about this. And you might notice that the Asiatic and Polynesian figures are dressed in stereotypical primitive garb, and in fact, the Polynesian here is represented as more of actually the image of a Melanesian or Papua New Guinean, which emphasizes the darker, blacker savagery, right? By contrast, the European is dressed plainly in a possibly military uniform, as would have fit the large presence of the US Navy in Hawaii at this time. And as I said, the magical result is a Hawaiian, a dark-haired, mustachioed man in a shirt and tie, his dress also subtly suggesting a military uniform. Particularly significant here is the erasure of women from this biological equation. As you can see, a plus sign stands in for the reproductive work. Each figure here is a man, obscuring but taking for granted that the reproductive work of producing this new race of Hawaiians would be eagerly taken up by Native Hawaiian women. Also notable is the way that this illustration adds up the various racial components to result in a Hawaiian rather than simply the multicultural catch-all category of American, which of course is also the underlying suggestion. This is a stark illustration of how settler colonialism required not only the assimilation of Native Hawaiians into the US, but also relied upon changing the category of Hawaiian into something that white Americans who had settled or aspired to settle in Hawaii would also be able to inhabit, perform, and possess. This illustration shows that European American men held the true authority to determine what Hawaiians are made of and made for, not only because they were clearly superior to pure Asiatics or Polynesians, but also because they were or could be part Hawaiian. Thus, the Hawaiian was implicitly or explicitly redefined as always at base a part Hawaiian, someone who is always part something else too. And though that part something else could be Asian, Asian Americans were also being constructed as this time as model minorities, as almost white in their own respect. As the illustration shows, this ideal of multiculturalism thus was premised on the assimilation of other races into the white race. The end product Hawaiian is not a true mix of the other three races, but simply a slightly darker version of the European. So Adams, given his strong belief in assimilation as the inevitable and desired end of race relations, took for granted that pure Polynesians and pure Asiatics were dying out. The Orientalists and tribal markings in the illustration portray Asians and Polynesians as anachronisms, stark contrasts to the neat modern uniforms of the European and Hawaiian figures. Noticeably, Polynesian stands in for pure Hawaiian as the most ancient, traditional, or authentic form of the Native Hawaiian. And crucially, describing Hawaiians as Polynesians in this context also transforms the Native Hawaiian into an immigrant, because Native Hawaiians are the descendants of ancient Polynesian voyagers who traveled to Hawaii from other Polynesian islands. So in this way, both the Asiatic and Polynesian figures here are represented as foreign to Hawaii, but smoothly vanishing into the Hawaiian figure that so resembles the European. So Hawaii as this melting pot idea was a fiction that Adams would continue to uphold despite ample ethnographic evidence to the contrary. So in the larger chapter in my book on Adams, I analyzed a lot of interview data that was created by Adams' graduate students under his direction with over 200 mixed-race Chinese Hawaiian families. And this is just like a little snippet of the transcripts that I looked at. So you can see that his graduate students asked people, the main part of these interviews was they asked, what is your attitude towards Chinese Hawaiian, or Caucasian Hawaiians? And they seem to really be looking for like positive or negative, right? Like yes or no. And really a striking fact about this interview data that I analyzed is that of the 206 individuals surveyed, over half of the respondents stated really negative feelings about pure Hawaiians. They stated that they intensely disliked, didn't care for, hated, or even feared pure Hawaiians. I think in this one it says, I can't get along with Hawaiians, I have no use for Hawaiians. And to be clear, these are people who were Hawaiian themselves. They were mixed race, Chinese and Hawaiian, right? So in contrast, attitudes toward both Chinese and Chinese Hawaiian people were overwhelmingly positive. 75% of those interviewed admired Chinese business sense, discipline, and other positive attributes, while 68% felt similarly about Chinese Hawaiians. So the negative opinions that were shared about Hawaiians tended to acknowledge that some individuals were good, but that as a race, Hawaiians were generally bad. This discourse echoed and sometimes explicitly referenced those earlier social scientific literatures about that separated Polynesians into two types, the whiter, almost Caucasian, and the blacker, Mongoloid, more akin to the Melanesian. Like, for example, one woman who was age 20 noted in her interview that her mother, who was pure Hawaiian, belonged to the fair type of Hawaiian. She explained, you know, there are three classes of Hawaiians. One is the dark class and the other very fair, almost blonde. Some of them have red hair. My mother has a straight nose, yes, something like a Grecian nose. And my mother has no Hawaiian ways. Really, she has no Hawaiian ways in her, and I'm proud of her because she can read and write. So this woman contrasted her mother's type of fair Hawaiian to other Hawaiians who are so funny looking. They have such big flat noses and they are so black. Those black Hawaiians were, in her opinion, too lazy and they are not ambitious. And others also distinguished between fair and black Hawaiians. I have just a lot of snippets from those interviews that maybe for a time I'll skip over, but we can come back to if you have more questions. But really, so what I argue about these interviews is that this survey data was meant to provide research for what would become Adams' most well-known work, Interracial Marriage in Hawaii, that was published in 1937. And it's a book that's still really positively cited today, especially in mixed race studies. While Adams acknowledges Margaret Lamb, who conducted the bulk of the interviews in the preface of the book, little of this survey data actually appears in the analysis. Rather, Adams focuses on demographic data to constantly reinforce the idea that Hawaii was becoming one people, indistinguishable from mainland US society. So I believe this interview data that documents a deeply internalized racism against Native Hawaiians that didn't make it into the book offers us insight into not only how Adams' idea of the melting pot was provably false, in the sense that Adams had ample data of the existence of racism specifically against Native Hawaiians, despite his claims that Hawaii was a racism-free paradise. More broadly, it allows us to glimpse how the logic of possession through whiteness functioned in such a way that encouraged racism against Native Hawaiians right alongside discourses proclaiming Native Hawaiians' proximity to whiteness. The racism in these interviews highlights how the idea of Polynesian whiteness has always meant to serve white settler claims to indigeneity in Polynesia, not to extend the privileges of whiteness to Polynesians. Okay, so that's all kind of rough, right? It's really rough to read those interviews because the racism is so deeply internalized, right? But of course, many Native Hawaiians and other Polynesians have long stood against this damaging logic of possession through whiteness, working in multiple ways to undo these racist discourses about an ancient theoretical Polynesian proximity to whiteness that actual dark Polynesians are nonetheless unable to access without generations of racial mixture with and assimilation into whiteness. So in the rest of my talk, I'll look at how two Polynesian contemporary artists, Adrian Pao and Yuki Kihara, challenge this logic, particularly in photographs that often feature their own bodies. Though their multiracial backgrounds are often noted with pride in their bios, Kihara, who is Samoan and Japanese, and Pao, who is Hawaiian and white, often subvert representations of contemporary mixed-race identity, insisting on dynamic readings of indigenous identity as an active decolonial force. In this way, they offer an alternative vision to the melting pot that assumes indigeneity will disappear into whiteness. And while I have largely focused on Hawaii in this talk, I include Kihara's work here despite her being located in the distinct context of Samoa to signal both my work's overall interest in the connections that are being regenerated among Polynesians and other Pacific Islander peoples, and because of the thematic resonance of her work with these racial discourses that I discussed. let's see. So I really see Kihara and Pau's work as strong illustrations of regenerative refusal. Regenerative refusals are difficult and do not hide that difficulty. We can think of difficulty in the sense theorized by cultural studies scholar Jennifer Doyle as work that elicits difficult emotions by potentially implicating the viewer in the ideological work of the colonial gaze. In her book, Doyle analyzes art by Carrie Mae Weems and James Luna, among others, and argues that the work's difficulty comes with our confrontation not with what we see, but with what seeing fails to give us. Doyle's analysis resonates with Native feminist scholar Audra Simpson's theorizing of ethnographic refusal, wherein she asks us to consider the stops, such as the stops or silences in an interview, or other impediments to knowing, as expansive in what they do not tell us. So those are some of the things I want you to keep in mind as we turn to these artists. So Kihara's work often directly responds to the histories of Western settler representations of Polynesians. And in fact, several series of Kiharas have been inspired by this particular ethnographic photograph from 1886 by New Zealander Thomas Andrew that's titled Samoan Halfcastes. And so the woman in this photo is wearing a Victorian-styled morning dress and staring directly into the camera, which makes it kind of very unique for this kind of style of ethnographic photograph. And so restaged in Kihara's work, the Samoan Halfcaste of this photo becomes the character that Kihara also refers to as a Samoan Salome, the classic femme fatale, dancing not the dance of the seven veils, but the Samoan dance forms of the Talalunga and Siva, and embodied through Kihara's identity as a Fa'afafine, which is a Samoan third gender category. Let's see. So yeah, here's an example, but you should also know that, so this series that, in which Kihara performs this character is also references Gauguin's painting, Where Do We Come From, What Are We, Where Are We Going, and which really displays all the hallmarks of Gauguin's tropes, right, that largely naked female Tahitian figures lounging in a florid tropical backdrop. And so what Kihara does is, instead of taking Gauguin's existential questions in the context of his views as Tahiti as a more pure society than the West, Kihara's series relays the title questions with the Samoan people in mind. And so in her black and white photographs, they show Kihara as Salome in that signature black morning dress in various locations around Samoa. So shortly after the 2012 Cyclone Evan hit, though this series also often references earlier tsunami, the 2009 tsunami Galu Afi. So her figure is usually photographed from behind, offering only glimpses of the side of her face, acting as an otherworldly guide to the viewer as she gazes upon still scenes. So in this photo, she's standing in Apia's landmark Church of the Immaculate Conception of Mary, and she gazes up at a chandelier that still hangs, though inches beyond, the roof has evidently been blown away and water covers much of the floor. In another photo, she stands in the ruins of an elementary school that was devastated by Tsunami Galu Afi, where the remaining concrete walls now enclose a field of flowers. Such photographs evoke mourning for what has been lost in recent storms, but also suggest hope in the figure's calm upward gaze and regeneration, as in the new flowers that are growing in the school's ruins. In other photographs in this series, the central figure gazes at other locations of historical and contemporary importance to Samoa, such as the former Mao headquarters, which was a center of activity in the movement for Samoan independence in 1962, and the Faleolo International Airport, which is symbolic of the nation's increasing reliance on a tourist economy. Though neither of these later sites are visibly impacted by the storms, the same questions of the series title, Where Do We Come From, What Are We, Where Are We Going, resonate just as much in these other locations. Though the series offers no simple answers to these questions, Kihara's use of the Salome figure is powerful and evocative. Unlike the sexualized exotic female figures in Gauguin's paintings, Kihara's Salome is composed I can't say that word right now, and on the move, with evident deep reverence for and belief in Samoa that transcends time. Okay, and let me skip to, so the other artist I look at is Kanaka Maoli artist Adrienne Pau, and her work employs many of the same themes of Kihara's, often using her own body photographed amidst the landscape of contemporary Hawaii. In this photo, which is called Lay Stand Protest or LayCool Kapa, a woman's body lies on the concrete tiles in front of the lay stands at the Honolulu International Airport, facing away from us, one arm stretched over her head. Her body is covered with purple orchid lei. And on the wall at her feet hang many more lei for sale: white tuberose, pink carnation, yellow puakeni. Her face is not in view, only the top of her head. She might be gazing up at the sky, or she might be dead. Not far away, a woman sitting below a large sign, Pua Melia, strings a lei, unperturbed, and in the background the sun shines on the parking lot, a bright blue sky peeking around the roof of the lei stands. Pau herself is this woman who's being photographed prostrate and covered by this ubiquitous, cheap, and hardy purple orchid lei. Like, these are like the cheapest leis you can buy in Hawaii, and that's what like tourist companies greet tourists with. So in an interview, Pau has explained that this title protest of this piece is not about the lei stands themselves, a site where, in addition to tourists, many local people stop to buy lei before picking up family members at the airports. I'm not anti-lei stand, she says. Leis are incorporated into our family. We use them, we love them. I feel like this is a protest about the commodification of culture. Thus, Pau is asserting a haunting presence, reminding viewers of the continued existence and belonging of Native Hawaiians, even in spaces constructed with tourists in mind. Pau further points out that this photograph is purposely humorous as well, as in the scene her protest is evidently gathering no attention, as the lei stand business goes on as usual. She also notes that the lei stand workers found her performance hilarious and enjoyed helping place the orchids on her body. So thus Pau really uses humor to leaven but not deny the routine painfulness and potential complicity of Native Hawaiians and other local residents of Hawaii in the commodification of Native Hawaiian culture and Native Hawaiian women's bodies. I'll share just one more of hers before wrapping it up. So in another work in the same series, it's titled Sugar Plantations Surrounding Birthing Stones, or Kopa'a Kapa Hard Sugar Covering. Pau is photographed here at Kukani Loko, which is a sacred site at the geographical center of Oahu, and it symbolizes the piko, or navel belly button, of the island of Oahu. And so this was a site that was also used by Native Hawaiian ali'i, the royalty, as a birthing site, with the stones at the site being used as backrests for ali'i women who are giving birth. In this piece, Pau is photographed lying in front of the birthing stones covered in sugar. So rather literally here, she's covered in this powdery whiteness. The sugar references the fact that in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, sugar plantations surrounded this sacred site, and the American sugar and pineapple plantation owners who overthrew the Hawaiian monarchy in 1893. Thus, the piece foregrounds these different, very old and conflicting forms of power that are rooted in this specific place. The piece makes viewers question if Pau's figure is one who would give birth at this site, or if she is a product of a birth at this site, or if perhaps births are not possible at this site anymore, or if the legacy of sugar has contaminated the productive power of Kukani Loko. However, as with all of the images in this series, the very solid, seemingly immovable stance of Pau's figure lying in the space reclaims and re-inhabits the space with the Native Hawaiian body. Pau challenges the certainty and finality of the settler colonial process of possession through whiteness, despite its centuries-long hold on the Pacific. Okay, yeah. I have other images we can talk more about, but I'll wrap up. So I really want to close by returning to this question that I opened with. What can Hawaii's teach America about race? Far from offering solutions to racial conflict on the U.S. mainland, Hawaii became the blank canvas upon which Adams and other Chicago School sociologists projected their dream of conflict-free racial assimilation into a heralded hybrid Neo-Hawaiian race. That new feminized race would submerge and contain the more threatening, masculine, dark side of Native Hawaiians, allowing the almost white side of Native Hawaiians to win out through combination with the relative whiteness of Asian Americans. Kihara and Pout's works are important because they provide confident refusals of the assumption that indigenous Pacific peoples are doomed to disappear through racial mixture or to become possessed by whiteness. Their works subtly mark an indigenous Polynesian presence not as a matter of unchanging authenticity, but existing in the midst of a modern landscape, long bound up with global capitalism and settler colonialism. So as long as the settler colonial idea of Hawaii as an idyllic racial melting pot persists, we will have more work to do in unsettling the logic of possession through whiteness. Towards that goal, Kihara and Pau provide regenerative models of refusing ongoing settler colonial violence while also enacting with both reverence and irreverence a continued Native feminist future. Thanks. Thank you, Maile, for this riveting talk. Now we'd like to open the space up for questions from the audience. Oh, sorry.
Thank you for that, Maile. It was really interesting. So I was really drawn to the imagery that you showed us of Yuki Kahara in that work, and how the weather is such a focal point in that. And it just brings me back to what you were saying about regenerative refusals and how it's not simply about return or denial, but an ongoing reckoning. That's how you stated it. So and that also reminds me of what you said just now about how we're bound up in like a modern landscape, and like that also implicates like the climate and the weather and that whole thing. But I was just wondering about how weather is wrapped up, if it is, in the term regenerative refusals, or how you grapple with that. If that makes sense as a question.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, very timely, right? I think hopefully we're all thinking a lot more about climate change with all the natural disasters going on. And I think Pacific Islanders, especially in the Marshall Islands and parts of Micronesia, have had to confront climate change like much earlier than anyone else because their islands are literally disappearing, right? And I think, in my larger work, I haven't addressed weather as much, but I think, I think there's a way that, like, denying climate change and, like, thinking particularly about, like, the islands that are disappearing, it goes along with this logic, right, that Pacific Islanders are destined to disappear, and so it's not a big deal. Or I think that's the like heart of the issue that I see Pacific Islander climate change activists like confronting, right? Is that as they go to these like global gatherings in New York or Paris, they're literally saying like, like our islands are disappearing and no one cares, right? And so I think there's a way that, of course, climate change is also bound up in colonialism and has to be addressed together because those logics are going together. Yeah. Mark.
Thanks, Maile. That was amazing. I'm just wondering, the recent work by Audra Simpson and other Indigenous scholars, and maybe also Irene Watson from Australia, talking about turning away, or Irene Watson says just walk away. And regenerative refusal seems to make a bridge to the aporia of if you just turn away, what happens next? And I'm wondering, are there the other sites in regenerative refusal that are the next stage of how you respond to settler colonial violence rather than just turn away, but other sites of regenerative refusal?
Yeah, thanks. I think what I've been trying to theorize with that is so often I see like indigenous protests like dismissed as like, oh, indigenous people are being impossible, like what do they want? Or like the refusal is read as something that's like entirely negative, which of course it is, it's a critique, right? But I think it's really important to be able to articulate how it's building something else. It's not just, as it is like trying to take apart colonialism, it's also trying to build something else, right? And I think like with Mauna Kea, the activism at Mauna Kea, where Native Hawaiians have so far prevented this 30-meter telescope from being built on this sacred site. The mainstream media all like consistently depicts Native Hawaiian activists as like barbaric, like backwards, anti-science people, right? When in fact, they're environmentalists too, right? Like they're saying like science is important, and we know because of science that this is going to potentially destroy the water aquifer for the entire island, which is not just Native Hawaiians, right? It's like everyone on the island. But there's, yeah, because of how embedded these colonial ideas are, right? It just gets stuck at like Native Hawaiians are impossible. Native Hawaiians are against progress, right? And so I feel like Native feminists really provide a language to hopefully get people to understand, or at least like get our communities to really understand that it's not just a negative, it's not just like a stopping, it's also a place to build a different future, right? And so the stopping the telescope builds a place where Native Hawaiians and other people can have actual relationships with this sacred place, right? That it's important to preserve because it's a storied, amazing place, and also it's the water aquifer for the whole island, right? And so I think that's what I've been trying to get at. And some of the other examples that I look at with regenerative refusals are also around science and the ways that there was a proposed Hawaiian genome project a decade ago in Hawaii that was trying to like database Native Hawaiian gene, right? And Native Hawaiian activists again were like, no, like we're not giving you our material. Like we object to the idea that the university would own our genetic material. And scientists were just like, oh, you're impossible, like can't work with Native Hawaiians or something, right? But what they were doing was trying to say like not only, it's not just that we don't want to participate, right? It's like we're trying to change how you think about your relationship to the communities, and the idea that there's like a gene that could be commodified, and like the way that scientists were selling it to the community was like, oh, there'll be potential financial benefits to you if you allow us to like trademark your gene or whatever. And Native Hawaiians were like no, like you don't think about genes that way, or we don't have to think about humanity that way, right? And I feel like, yeah, again, I just feel like Native feminists have some of the language that is most able to get at how these are generative things. It's not just a negative. Yeah.
I'm really curious about the term possession that you use. On the one hand, it connotes property, and on the other, maybe just because it's close to Halloween, like this haunting thing,
Yeah.
right? And particularly in relation to whiteness as something that haunts Polynesia and globally, really.
Yeah.
I wonder if that, what might be productive about conjoining, the Cheryl Harris kind of property, whiteness is property thing with the possibility, and I'm just thinking out loud here, around whiteness as a form of haunting.
Yeah, thanks, absolutely. I think that's what I'm trying to get at, and trying to think through the ways that Black people have been made into property in certain ways, right, that are distinct from Indigenous, the ways that whiteness relates to Indigenous people. And so I think what I'm trying to do is kind of show how whiteness attempts to own indigeneity in this way that is less overt sometimes, but always there, and kind of sometimes more difficult to pinpoint because, I'm trying to think of other smart things I could say about it. But, I mean, I just think like that white idea that there's such a deeply ingrained idea that a lot of white people have that they're also indigenous, like through whether it be like a great mythical Cherokee grandmother who's a princess, right? But I think that doesn't really happen in Hawaii in the same way. But there's kind of always in Hawaii there's the sense that like everyone is racially mixed, so like everyone could be Hawaiian. That's kind of the discourse in Hawaii, right? But it's a similar thing, and there's a similar way that indigeneity is always like up for grabs. Like it can't be owned by indigenous people. It's like owned by everyone because we're all whatever. That's the discourse, right? And I think and it is kind of this haunting that it's hard to have language to explain it, right? Because especially in Hawaii, a lot of us are racially mixed, and there are real relationships between Asian Americans and Native Hawaiians, like historically, that are important and that can't be dismissed, right? But I think we need more language to really break down like just how colonial that idea of the melting pot is, right? And how it damages both Native Hawaiians and Asian Americans, right? Because it's premised on both groups melting into whiteness. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. That was just terrific. I have a question about anthropology and white colonial anthropologists. So you were mentioning Park and Adams from the Chicago School, but what about Bateson and Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict? How do they figure in this picture in terms of similar kinds of productions of racialized bodies and the colonial imperial practice of anthropology?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, there's so much to be said about all the anthropologists who have worked in the Pacific. I focus a lot on the physical anthropologists because they're most directly engaged with the racial origin theories, right? And so Mead and others were a lot less interested in that. But of course, they took for granted or kind of added their own onto these ideas too, right? But I think, like I see in Mead's in Coming of Age in Samoa, her use of Samoan women as it's so extractive, right? She went to Samoa to make this argument about American teenagers, right? She went there to say that American teenagers are not naturally grumpy or, she went to say that there's this other place where being a teenager is liberating and sexually free, right? And so the way it is in America isn't naturally biologically like that, but it could be different, right? Which was an important argument to be made, right? That anti-biology argument is an important argument to be made, right? But the way that she used Samoans to make that argument was premised on the idea that Samoans were, naturally possessions of whiteness in a way, right? Because she went to American Samoa, and even as, she really presents in the book, and all the press about the book was about how distant and primitive and backwards American Samoa was, but it was part of America, right? Her research was enabled by it being part of America, right? And so even as she wouldn't have said that those Samoans were white or almost white, right? She was saying the opposite, but it was really, really played on these same racial tropes and the idea that there was something that was naturally belonging to whiteness there. Okay. Well, yeah, thank you so much for having me.